I didn't do it. You have to believe me.
The evidence says otherwise. We have your records.
Those are fake. Someone is setting me up.
And the witness on this phone? You're not walking away.
Watch me.
They say every king gets the crown he deserves, but nobody warns you that the sharpest blade at your throat will have your own blood on the handle. Jang Tae-sung ruled Seoul's underworld for 27 years without a single conviction, without a single public confession, without a single enemy brave enough to say his name above a whisper. It took his own son 11 hours to destroy all of it. The night Jang Tae-sung was born, a typhoon knocked out the power across half of Busan. His mother, Jang Soon-hee, labored by candlelight in a 2-room apartment that smelled of salted fish and old timber, while his father paced the hallway outside, smoking cigarettes with the nervous energy of a man who already knew this child was going to be expensive. The midwife who delivered him would later tell neighbors, with the dramatic certainty of someone who absolutely was not there for the follow-up, that the baby came out silent. No cry, just open eyes, dark and still, looking around the room like he was already taking inventory. Whether that story was true or embellished by years of retrospective mythology, nobody could say. What was certain was this: Busan in the early 1970s was not a city that rewarded softness. It was a port city, loud, salt-crusted, perpetually exhausted, with a harbor that swallowed men whole and spat out only the ones who learned to swallow back. The working-class neighborhood of Seoul, where the Jang family rented their apartment on the 4th floor of a building that groaned in the wind like it was always one storm away from a confession, was the kind of place where ambition was either quietly starved or quietly weaponized. Tae-sung's father, Jang Hyun-woo, was neither ambitious nor particularly dangerous, which in the world he moved through amounted to roughly the same thing. He collected debts for a local organization run by a man named Seoul Rock, a kangpai boss of the old school who wore tailored suits 30 years before Seoul made them fashionable and spoke in a voice so low that men instinctively leaned in, which was, of course, exactly the point. Hyun-woo was the messenger, the warm body sent ahead of the real threat. He wore bruises the way some men wear medals, frequently, without complaint, and with a quiet understanding that they were simply part of the uniform. Young Tae-sung observed all of this from the careful distance of a child who understood, even without the vocabulary to explain it, that his father was a tool and tools did not get to choose how they were used. He was 12 the first time he saw Seoul Rock in person. The man arrived in a black sedan on a Tuesday afternoon, not to collect, not to threaten, but simply to pass through, and the entire street underwent an immediate and involuntary reorganization. The produce vendor on the corner packed up mid-transaction. A woman hanging laundry on the second-floor balcony across the street retreated inside with such speed that 3 shirts were left behind, flapping in the wind like tiny flags of surrender. Even the dogs, the scrappy, opinionated strays of Seoul who feared absolutely nothing, found urgent business elsewhere. Tae-sung stood at his window and watched, and did not move, and did not look away. Something happened in him in that moment that he would spend the rest of his life either chasing or outrunning, depending on the year and the company. It wasn't fear. He had already learned that fear was a tax paid by people who hadn't figured out the system yet. It wasn't admiration, exactly, though it wore admiration's clothes. It was something colder and more clarifying than either. It was recognition. The understanding that power wasn't loud. Power didn't knock. Power arrived, and the world rearranged itself, and that was all. Be the thing the world rearranges itself for, he thought, in the wordless way that 12-year-olds think enormous thoughts. He never forgot it. By 17, he had outgrown his father's orbit entirely, not with rebellion or confrontation. Drama was for people who couldn't think, but with the quiet, deliberate gravity shift of someone who had simply decided to become a different kind of object. He attached himself to the younger wolves working Busan's port, men who moved contraband with the efficiency of licensed freight companies and significantly less paperwork. He was fast, precise, and possessed of a social intelligence so acute it unnerved people who prided themselves on reading rooms. He knew who needed flattery, who responded only to fear, and, most crucially, who simply needed to be waited on. In a world populated almost entirely by impatient, impulsive, combustible men, patience was not a virtue. It was a superpower. At 25, He arrived in Seoul with a single bag, a network of 3 reliable contacts, and a plan so long-term it would have sounded delusional to anyone he'd had the poor judgment to share it with. He kept it to himself. The city received him the way Seoul receives everyone, loudly, indifferently, at full speed. But Tae-sung had not come to be received. He had come to install himself, slowly and invisibly, the way a root installs itself in concrete. No announcement, no drama, just relentless, patient pressure until one morning the concrete simply cracks. He found his opening inside the Haryong Brotherhood, one of Seoul's oldest and most structurally calcified criminal syndicates. Not as muscle, not as a runner, but as something the Brotherhood had never quite thought to recruit for, a thinker. The aging boss, Lim Cheol-soo, a man who had survived 4 decades of Seoul's underworld by being both genuinely ruthless and genuinely suspicious of anyone who wasn't, recognized the gift immediately. He just didn't recognize the danger attached to it. Not yet. The boy who watched from the window had arrived in the city where kings were made. He brought no weapon, no army, no inheritance. Just eyes that missed nothing, and a patience that made other men's ambitions look like children running with scissors. Seoul had no idea what had just walked through its door. Seoul, in 1993, was a city suffering from a very specific and dangerous condition. It believed its own hype. The Han River gleamed at night, like a ribbon of liquid ambition. Glass towers were multiplying across Gangnam like a particularly prosperous infection. Hyundai and Samsung were printing money with the cheerful productivity of institutions that had never once considered the concept of enough. The 1988 Olympics had handed Seoul a mirror, and Seoul had looked into it and decided, with complete sincerity, that what it saw was the future. Meanwhile, beneath all that glass and ambition and Han River glitter, the Kangpai was doing what it had always done, running the parts of the city that the mirror didn't show. Tae-sung had been inside the Haryong Brotherhood for 3 years when he made his first truly significant move. Not a violent one, not even a particularly dramatic one, by the standards of men who settled disagreements with car doors and baseball bats in underground parking lots. It was, in fact, a spreadsheet, or the closest equivalent a mid-90s Korean crime syndicate maintained, which was a leather-bound ledger kept in a fireproof safe in Lim Cheol-soo's office on the 4th floor of a building in Mapo-gu that officially operated as an import consulting firm and unofficially operated as the nervous system of a criminal empire. Tae-sung had asked to see it once. Just once. Lim Cheol-soo, amused by the audacity and faintly entertained by the young man's bloodless confidence, had allowed it. Tae-sung spent 40 minutes with the ledger. He asked no questions, made no notes, took nothing. Then he handed it back, thanked Lim Cheol-soo with the precise degree of deference the old man expected, and left. 2 weeks later, he presented a verbal summary, from memory, of every financial inconsistency in the Brotherhood's last 18 months of operations. 11 discrepancies. 3 of them pointed directly at a lieutenant named Baek Jun-ho, a broad-shouldered, perpetually scowling man who had been in the Brotherhood since before Tae-sung was born and wore his seniority the way some men wear cologne, aggressively, and in quantities that suggested deep personal insecurity. Lim Cheol-soo had listened without expression. Then he had dismissed everyone else from the room and looked at Tae-sung for a long, assessing silence that lesser men would have rushed to fill with reassurances. Tae-sung sat in it like it was comfortable furniture. "You memorized it," Lim Cheol-soo said finally. "I have a good memory," Tae-sung replied. "And what do you want for this information?" Tae-sung had smiled then, not widely, not warmly, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had already decided the answer 3 months ago and was only now being polite enough to say it out loud. "Nothing yet," he said. That yet did more work than 1,000 threats. Lim Cheol-soo, who had not survived 40 years in Seoul's underworld by being slow, understood it perfectly. He was not looking at an informant or a schemer. He was looking at a strategist, someone playing a game with a longer board than everyone else in the room. He did not promote Tae-sung that day. That would have been too obvious, too fast, and it would have made Baek Jun-ho, who had the political instincts of a territorial rhinoceros, immediately dangerous. Instead, Lim Cheol-soo began a slow, subtle repositioning. A better assignment here. A more sensitive errand there. Access to rooms that junior members had no business entering. It was the organizational equivalent of watering a particular plant and watching, with a mixture of pride and private unease, as it grew faster than expected. Baek Joon-ho noticed. Of course he did. Men like Baek Joon-ho always noticed when someone was rising, the same way they always noticed when someone was looking at their food. His response was predictable, a campaign of low-level hostility, muttered commentary, the casual physical intimidation that passed for office politics in an organization where the HR department was whoever was biggest in the room. Tae-sung absorbed it all with an equanimity so complete it was, frankly, more threatening than any retaliation would have been. There is nothing more unsettling to a bully than a target who simply does not appear to register the bullying. It suggests the target is either stupid or operating from a position of such comprehensive security that the attacks feel irrelevant. Tae-sung was not stupid. He was building, quietly, methodically, with the long patience of a man who understood that the best architecture is invisible until it's finished. He was learning the Brotherhood's geography, not just the financial map, but the human one, who was loyal to Lim Cheol-soo out of genuine respect and who out of profitable habit, who would follow power wherever it moved and who would stand still when the ground shifted, who had secrets and what shape those secrets were. In a criminal organization, information is currency. Tae-sung was, by 1996, quietly the wealthiest man in the room. He was also, by this point, no longer entirely alone. He had found, in the Brotherhood's accounting structure, a young woman named Ha-eun, sharp, precise, with the kind of focused intelligence that organizations like the Brotherhood typically wasted on bookkeeping. Ha-eun had grown up in Seoul's Dabong district, raised by a grandmother who ran a Pojangmaka street stall and had the financial acumen of someone who had survived on razor-thin margins for 40 years. She had inherited the grandmother's gift for numbers and the street's gift for reading people, and she had ended up in the Brotherhood the way many talented people end up in the wrong room, through a combination of circumstance, necessity, and underestimated potential. Tae-sung recognized her immediately, not romantically, at least not initially, though Seoul winters have a way of rearranging such distinctions, but professionally, with the clarity of a collector who has just found something rare in an unremarkable place. You see things they don't see, he told her once, during a late night in the office, surrounded by ledgers and cold coffee. Everyone sees things, she replied, without looking up from her work. Most people just decide not to. He had laughed, genuinely, one of the few times that year, and decided then that she was the most dangerous person he'd met in Seoul. He meant it as the highest compliment. Together, they began constructing what would eventually become the financial backbone of his empire. Invisible accounts, layered transactions, legitimate businesses woven through criminal ones like structural rebar, impossible to extract without pulling everything down. They were building a fortress, and they were building it inside someone else's house. Lim Cheol-soo, watching from his office, allowed it to happen, partly because he was aging and needed the infrastructure, partly because he had begun to understand, with the weary wisdom of a man who had seen every play in the book, that Tae-sung was not building against him. Not yet. And partly, if he was being honest with himself in the dark hours of sleepless nights, because he had come to the quiet, uncomfortable conclusion that the Brotherhood's future had already been decided. It just hadn't announced itself yet. In Seoul's criminal underworld, everyone was playing chess. Tae-sung had already flipped the board and was setting up the next game. And Ha-eun? She was keeping score with a smile that gave absolutely nothing away. There is an old Korean saying that loosely translates to, "The river does not ask the stone for permission." Jang Tae-sung had never said it out loud. He didn't need to. He was it. By 1997, he had been inside the Haryong Brotherhood for 6 years, and the Brotherhood, without fully realizing it, had begun to reorganize itself around him the way water reorganizes itself around a new stone dropped into a stream. Naturally, inevitably, without drama or announcement. Lim Cheol-soo still sat at the head of the table, still commanded the room, still received the bows and the deference and the carefully worded reports that senior men brought him like tribute. But the room itself, its temperature, its direction, its unspoken consensus about what mattered and what didn't, had shifted. Tae-sung had not taken anything. He had simply become necessary. That distinction was everything. In November of 1997, South Korea's economy detonated. The Asian financial crisis arrived not with a knock, but with a demolition crew, and it went through the Korean economy the way a wrecking ball goes through a building that everyone had agreed, right up until that moment, was structurally sound. The IMF bailout, $58.4 billion, the largest in the fund's history at that point, came with conditions so humiliating that they were discussed in hushed, wounded tones in every boardroom, every household, and every backroom office in the country. Corporations that had seemed immortal collapsed overnight. Banks that had operated for decades shuttered with the apologetic speed of restaurants that had run out of food. Unemployment tripled. Men who had worked the same company for 20 years found themselves in the street with severance packages that wouldn't cover 3 months of rent. It was, in the most literal sense, a catastrophe. For Tae-sung, it was a calendar event he had been waiting for. Not because he was callous, though his detractors would later argue otherwise with considerable enthusiasm, but because he had seen it coming 18 months before anyone in a suit admitted the possibility. Ha-eun's financial architecture had flagged the warning signs early. The unsustainable debt ratios in the chaebol system, the overheated real estate valuations, the currency exposure that made the won about as stable as a dinner table with one short leg. They had moved accordingly, quietly, without announcement. While Seoul's legitimate financial world was busy discovering the floor, Tae-sung was buying it. Distressed properties in Mapo-gu, Yongsan, and the emerging corridors of eastern Gangnam went for fractions of their 1995 valuations. Failing small businesses, restaurants, entertainment venues, private security firms, a mid-sized construction company whose owner wept during the handover meeting in a way that Tae-sung filed away as both humanly understandable and strategically irrelevant, were absorbed into a holding structure that Ha-eun had designed with the elegance of someone who genuinely enjoyed making illegal things look boring. An entertainment agency, Haesong Creative, acquired 3 struggling management contracts, including 2 youth performance groups that nobody expected to amount to anything. One of them, 3 years later, would have a moderately successful single that played in convenience stores across Seoul for an entire summer. The royalties were immaculate. The optics were impeccable. Nothing launders ambition quite like a catchy pop chorus. Baek Joon-ho, watching all of this from his increasingly peripheral position in the Brotherhood's hierarchy, was furious in the sustained, low-burning way of a man who knows he is being outmaneuvered and cannot identify the specific moment it began. He complained to Lim Cheol-soo twice. The first time, the old man listened patiently and said nothing instructive. The second time, Lim Cheol-soo looked at him with the tired eyes of someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for events to confirm it, and told him to focus on his assigned territory. It was, in the language of men like Lim Cheol-soo, a dismissal so complete it was practically a retirement package. Baek Joon-ho understood. He began, quietly, building alliances of his own. This was his first serious mistake. His second was assuming that Tae-sung didn't know. Tae-sung knew everything. He had known about Joon-ho's quiet conversations with 2 rival syndicate representatives in Incheon since the 3rd meeting. He knew about the money Joon-ho had moved without Brotherhood authorization, not because he had gone looking for it, but because Ha-eun's financial architecture was threaded so completely through the Brotherhood's operations that unauthorized movement showed up like a fingerprint on clean glass. He said nothing. He waited. He added it to the ledger in his memory, where it sat alongside 11 other documented inconsistencies, gathering compound interest. Patience, in Tae-sung's hands, was not passive. It was loaded. It was during this period, the strange, electric tension of late 1998, Seoul rebuilding itself from the crisis wreckage with the grim determination of a city that had too much pride for self-pity, that Tae-sung and Ha-eun's relationship shifted from professional alliance to something neither of them had planned for and both of them, characteristically, refused to announce. It happened the way most real things happen between people who are too intelligent for romantic theater, gradually, then completely, with very little ceremony and considerable mutual recognition. Ha-eun was not a woman who needed rescuing, and Tae-sung was not a man who offered it, which made the space between them, paradoxically, the safest either had occupied in years. She saw him clearly, without the distortion of fear or awe that blurred his image for everyone else in his orbit. She saw the calculation and the vision and the cold precision, and she also saw, in rare unguarded moments, the 12-year-old boy at the window in Busan, watching a man in a black sedan make the world rearrange itself. She had never told him she saw it. She didn't need to. He knew. They were, in the truest sense, equally matched, which in a world built almost entirely on imbalance, was its own kind of revolution. In the spring of 1999, Ha-eun discovered she was pregnant. Tae-sung received the news with the same stillness he brought to every significant development, a long, measuring silence, eyes focused on something slightly past the middle distance, the internal machinery visibly engaged. Then he had looked at her directly, with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not warmth, exactly. Something more structural than warmth. Something that looked, in the vocabulary of a man who had spent his entire life building fortresses, remarkably like commitment. "Everything I build," he said quietly, "needs to last past me." Ha-eun had looked at him for a long moment. Then she had returned to her work, which was, for her, the highest form of agreement. Their son, Jang Min-jun, was born in December 1999, on the last night of a century that had tried, with considerable persistence, to break both his parents. It had failed. Seoul rang in the millennium with fireworks over the Han River. In a private room above a Gangnam restaurant, Tae-sung held his son for the first time with the careful, slightly overwhelmed grip of a man who had handled dangerous things his entire life and understood, with sudden and absolute clarity, that this was the most dangerous thing he had ever held. Not because Min-jun was a threat, because he was the only thing Tae-sung had ever possessed that he could not afford to lose. Every empire, no matter how brilliantly constructed, contains within it the seed of its own undoing. Tae-sung had built his with genius, patience, and iron nerve. He had forgotten to account for one variable: love makes kings mortal. And mortality, in Seoul's underworld, had a very specific interest rate. Before we go further, the Brotherhood knew Baek Joon-ho was stealing and scheming, and they stayed silent. Does that make them just as guilty as he was? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if you believe loyalty should never be used as a cover for corruption, hit that like button, because only the Baek Joon-hos of this world would scroll past without one. Power, at its peak, develops a particular kind of blindness. Not the dramatic, operatic blindness of kings in Shakespeare plays, the thunderstorm speeches and the obvious omens and the advisors wringing their hands in corridors. No, the blindness that comes with real, sustained, structural power is quieter than that, and considerably more dangerous. It is the blindness of a man who has been right so many times, for so long, that he has quietly reclassified being right from a skill into a condition. Something permanent, something constitutional, something that simply is, the way gravity is, the way the Han River flows south. Jang Tae-sung, by the year 2005, had been right about nearly everything for nearly a decade. He had been right about the financial crisis and had profited from it with surgical precision while better connected men lost fortunes. He had been right about Baek Joon-ho's disloyalty and had archived it patiently until the moment it was most useful. He had been right about Seoul's real estate corridors, about the entertainment industry's coming boom, about the precise structural weaknesses in 3 rival organizations that he had, in succession, either absorbed or quietly dismantled without a single public confrontation. He had been right about Ha-eun, about her capabilities, her loyalty, her judgment, in ways that had repaid themselves compounded, year after year, in the currency of a partnership so functionally complete that even his enemies, who had many unpleasant things to say about Tae-sung, generally conceded that his taste in people was impeccable. Being right that consistently is intoxicating. Being right that consistently, in a world where being wrong usually costs someone a significant portion of their physical well-being, is practically a religion. Tae-sung had not become arrogant. Arrogance was for men who needed other people to confirm their superiority. He had become something quieter and more terminal, certain. And certainty, unlike arrogance, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't swagger. It simply stops asking certain questions, because it has already decided it knows the answers. The question it stopped asking, sometime around 2005, was the one that mattered most. What am I not seeing? The succession dinner happened on a Friday night in November, in a private dining room on the 32nd floor of a Gangnam building whose lobby hosted a respectable architecture firm and whose upper floors hosted considerably less respectable arrangements. Lim Cheol-soo had called it. The old man was 71 now, moving carefully, speaking slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that every word cost something and had decided to spend them wisely. He had built the Brotherhood across 4 decades, survived 2 government crackdowns, 3 internal power struggles, and the Asian financial crisis, and he had done it by understanding, better than almost anyone, the difference between holding power and transferring it. Transferring power, done correctly, was the most sophisticated act in the criminal playbook. Done incorrectly, it was a civil war with better catering. Lim Cheol-soo intended to do it correctly. The room held 9 men. Senior Brotherhood lieutenants, territory heads, the organization's 2 most trusted legal intermediaries, men who existed in the comfortable gray zone between the criminal world and the legitimate one, carrying briefcases in both directions with the practiced neutrality of experienced ferry operators. Baek Joon-ho sat at the far end of the table with the tight, controlled expression of a man who had spent months preparing a speech and had just realized, 3 minutes before delivery, that the audience already knew the ending. He was 54, still broad, still physically imposing in the way that men who were once genuinely dangerous remain physically imposing even as the actual danger migrates elsewhere. He had spent the last 2 years consolidating what allies he had left, calling in favors, positioning himself with the exhausting political energy of someone who suspected they were losing but refused to accept the math. He had prepared for many scenarios tonight. He had not prepared for a red envelope. Tae-sung arrived last, not rudely late, but precisely late, the kind of calibrated entrance that communicates, without a single word, that the person making it operates on their own schedule and considers this a simple statement of fact rather than a power display. He was 40 years old. He wore a dark suit with the easy comfort of a man for whom clothing was armor he no longer needed to think about. He sat down, poured tea for Lim Cheol-soo first, then for the man to his left, then for himself, in a sequence of social choreography so natural it looked unrehearsed. It was not unrehearsed. Lim Cheol-soo spoke for 12 minutes about the Brotherhood's history, its principles, its obligations to the men who served it and the territories that sustained it. It was a good speech, the kind that carried genuine weight because the man delivering it had actually lived the content rather than simply memorized it. Several men around the table were visibly moved. One of the legal intermediaries, a man named Oh Sang-min who had the reputation of a man who had never once allowed his emotions to inconvenience his professional judgment, studied his tea with sudden and intense concentration. Then Lim Cheol-soo said the word that changed everything. Succession. The room's temperature dropped approximately 3 degrees. Not metaphorically. Something physiological happened to the 9 men around that table. A collective tensing, a subtle redistribution of oxygen, a shared and simultaneous decision to become very still. Tae-sung reached into his jacket and produced a red envelope. He placed it on the table with the quiet finality of a man setting down the last piece of a puzzle he had been assembling for 7 years. Slid it, with 2 fingers, across the polished wood toward Lim Cheol-soo. Said nothing. Simply waited with the specific, devastating patience that was, at this point, his most recognizable weapon. Lim Cheol-soo opened it. He read it without expression, which was its own expression, the absence of surprise on the face of a man who had seen everything was, in this context, the most eloquent possible response. He read it twice. Then he placed it face down on the table, folded his hands over it, and looked at Baek Joon-ho with the tired, clean gaze of a man closing a very long chapter. Joon-ho had not seen the contents, but he read the room with the desperate accuracy of a man who understands he is already past the point where reading matters. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was steady. His hands, under the table, were not. "A record," Tae-sung said simply. "Yours." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in Seoul that night. The envelope contained 14 pages, 11 documented financial discrepancies, 3 unauthorized territorial negotiations with rival organizations in Incheon. The same ones Tae-sung had known about since the 3rd meeting, the ones he had filed in his memory and waited on with the patience of a man who understood that timing was the difference between a knife and a key. Every figure verified. Every date confirmed. Every signature, where applicable, included. Baek Joon-ho looked at Tae-sung across the table. The expression on his face cycled through several distinct phases: shock, calculation, fury, the specific cold recognition of a man realizing that his opponent had been several moves ahead for so long that the game he thought he was playing had never actually existed. "You've been building this for years," Joon-ho said. "I've been documenting it," Tae-sung replied. "You built it yourself." It was, objectively, the most devastating thing said in that room in 40 years of Brotherhood dinners. Several men around the table made the unanimous and sensible decision to find their tea extraordinarily interesting. Lim Cheol-soo spoke for 3 minutes. Quietly, finally, with the absolute authority of a man spending his last significant currency on something worth the price. By midnight, it was done. Jang Tae-sung was named head of the Haryong Brotherhood. He was 40 years old. He had been in Seoul for 15 years. He had arrived with a single bag, 3 contacts, and a plan so long-term it had looked, at the time, like delusion. Baek Joon-ho left the building without his title, his territory, or the speech he had prepared. He still had his life, which under the circumstances was a generosity that nobody in the room failed to notice, and which Tae-sung had extended not out of sentiment, but out of the cold strategic recognition that martyrs are more dangerous than exiles. Outside, Seoul glittered across the Han River, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unaware that its underworld had just changed hands. Ha-eun, waiting in the car below, looked up when he climbed in. She read his face in approximately 4 seconds. "Done?" she asked. "Done," he said. She nodded once, started the engine, and drove. The crown had no ceremony, no trumpet, no cathedral, just a red envelope, a silent room, and a drive home through the Seoul night. But then, the heaviest crowns always fit the quietest heads. There is a specific kind of loneliness that lives inside absolute power. Not the loneliness of isolation. Tae-sung was never alone, not technically, not logistically. There were always men in the corridor, always calls to take, always rooms full of people whose livelihoods depended on his continued existence and whose loyalty, while genuine in most cases, was also structurally inseparable from their self-interest. He understood this. He had, in fact, designed it this way because loyalty rooted in self-interest was more reliable than loyalty rooted in affection. Affection changed. Self-interest was consistent. No, the loneliness was different from that. It was the loneliness of a man who could not be surprised, who had seen so many moves ahead for so long that the present had begun to feel like a place he was only visiting while his mind lived permanently in the future. It was the loneliness of a chess grandmaster forced to play checkers for 20 years, technically undefeated, privately unstimulated, and increasingly unsure whether the game was worth the board. Hao noticed it before he did. She always noticed things before he did, which remained one of the few consistent sources of genuine pleasure in his life. The rare experience of being known so completely by someone that they could see inside the architecture of his silence. "You're getting comfortable," she told him one evening in 2008, without looking up from the financial reports spread across their kitchen table. They had moved, by then, into a penthouse apartment in Yongsan, not ostentatious by the standards of Seoul's legitimate wealthy, but quietly exceptional in the way that things chosen by people with actual taste rather than performing wealth tend to be. "I'm getting effective," he replied. "Those aren't the same thing," she said. Comfortable men stopped checking the foundations. He had smiled at that, filed it, did not fully act on it. This was, in retrospect, the hairline crack. The empire in 2010 was a thing of considerable, if entirely invisible, magnificence. The Haryong Brotherhood had, under Tae-sung's leadership, undergone a transformation so complete that it bore only structural resemblance to the organization Lim Cheol-soo had run. The old boss, retired now, living in a quiet house in Gyeonggi-do with a garden he tended with the focused devotion of a man who had decided that growing things was the appropriate final chapter after decades of the alternative, had visited once, in 2009, and spent 20 minutes walking through the holding company's legitimate business portfolio with the expression of a man reading a novel in a language he recognizes but can no longer quite speak. "You made it look like a corporation," Lim Cheol-soo had said, with a tone that contained equal parts admiration and something that might have been mild grief. "It is a corporation," Tae-sung replied. "It just has a more flexible compliance department." The old man had laughed, the deep, genuine laugh of someone who had lived long enough to find things funny that they probably shouldn't, and left without further commentary. The legitimate holdings by 2010 included 14 real estate assets across Seoul and Busan, the construction company acquired during the crisis, 2 hospitality businesses, a private security firm, Chonggang Solutions, which operated with complete legitimacy and served, among other clients, 3 mid-sized corporations whose executives remained pleasantly unaware of who ultimately signed their security contract, and Haesong Creative, the entertainment agency, which had grown from 3 struggling management contracts into a genuine, moderately profitable enterprise with 6 acts, a small recording studio in Hongdae, and enough legitimate revenue to make the financial architecture surrounding it essentially impenetrable from the outside. The illegitimate holdings were, by design, impossible to catalog from any external position. Tae-sung had structured the Brotherhood's criminal operations the way an experienced engineer structures a load-bearing wall. The weight was real, the function was essential, but the mechanism was hidden inside layers of material that looked, from every accessible angle, like something entirely ordinary. Law enforcement had tried 4 times in 7 years. For times, they had walked into walls. The chief investigator assigned to the Brotherhood's file, a tenacious, chronically underfunded Yoon Ji-chul was not wrong. He was simply out-resourced and outstructured, fighting a battle whose terrain had been designed specifically to exhaust him. It was not a fair fight. Tae-sung had never particularly advertised that it would be. Min-jun came home from London in the spring of 2023. He was 23 years old, carrying a business degree from King's College, a British accent that surfaced unpredictably in certain vowel sounds, and an interior life that his father had, across the years of his absence, significantly underestimated. Tae-sung had sent him to London at 15. Not out of sentiment. Sentiment remained, in his personal operational framework, a resource to be carefully rationed, but out of strategy. A son educated abroad, fluent in international business, culturally legible to the legitimate world, was an asset. The next evolution of the empire. The face it would eventually show when the final layer of legitimacy was complete, and the criminal infrastructure could be quietly, methodically retired into the merely aggressive capitalism that distinguished it from the illegal variety, primarily by the presence of correct paperwork. He had planned Min-jun's return the way he planned everything, in advance, in detail, with contingencies. He had not planned for who Min-jun had become. The boy who had left Seoul at 15, quiet, watchful, his father's eyes in a younger face, had returned as something Tae-sung genuinely had not modeled, a man with a conscience that was not theoretical. Not the performed conscience of someone who had learned that ethical language was professionally useful, not the selective conscience of someone who disapproved of other people's methods while remaining comfortable with their own. A real one, the inconvenient kind, the kind that had apparently been growing quietly in London for 8 years, fed by distance and education, and the particular clarity that comes from seeing your own family from far enough away to perceive its actual shape. Min-jun had spent 8 years away from the smell of it, away from the normalization of it, away from the gradual, daily erosion of moral visibility that came from living inside a world where the wrong things were ordinary. From London, the shape of his father's empire had looked different than it did from inside it. It had looked, with increasing and unavoidable clarity, like what it was. He said none of this immediately upon returning. He moved back into the family apartment. He attended the meetings his father carefully staged for him. Introductory, low sensitivity, designed to ease him in gradually. The way you introduce someone to a very deep pool by starting at the shallow end. He was polite. He was attentive. He asked good questions. He gave nothing away. He had, it turned out, inherited certain things from his father after all. Ha-eun watched him across dinner tables with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 20 years reading rooms and understood, within 2 weeks of his return, that her son was not settling in. He was deciding. She said nothing to Tae-sung. This was its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't thought to ask yet. And she was, in the complex emotional architecture of a woman who loved both of them, and could see exactly where this was going, not entirely sure which side of the coming collision she was on. Some walls, she had learned across 20 years of building them, could not be reinforced from the inside. Some cracks ran all the way to the foundation. Min-jun sat in his father's meetings and took no notes, because he had learned, from his father, with considerable irony, that the most dangerous records are the ones kept in memory. He was 23, and already accumulating a ledger of his own. Like father, like son, except in the direction of the door. The human conscience is not a switch. It does not flip. It does not announce itself with a dramatic moment of clarity and a swelling orchestral score and a single tear tracking cinematically down a cheekbone. That version exists in films, in the kind of films where the protagonist's moral awakening is conveniently timed to the third act and comes with enough visual poetry to distract from the fact that it arrived approximately 40 minutes too late to save anyone significant. Real conscience is slower than that, more architectural. It builds the way water damage builds inside a wall, invisible for months, sometimes years, until one morning the surface shifts and you realize the structure behind it has been compromised for longer than anyone admitted. Jang Min-jun's conscience had been building since he was 17 years old, sitting in a King's College library in London, reading a case study in a corporate ethics module about organized crime's economic impact on urban development in Southeast Asian cities, and recognizing, with the specific, nauseating vertigo of personal relevance, that the anonymized case study subject bore a structural resemblance to his father's business portfolio that went considerably beyond coincidence. He had closed the textbook, sat very still for approximately 4 minutes, then opened it again and read to the end. That was the water getting in. What followed was 6 years of internal architecture, the slow, unglamorous, privately agonizing process of a young man building a moral position inside a life that had been constructed, with extraordinary care and skill, to make such positions as difficult as possible to maintain. He loved his father. That was not the question, and never had been. The question, the one that kept him company on London nights and spoke to him in the gap between sleep and waking, was whether love was sufficient justification for silence. He had reached his answer by the time he boarded the plane back to Seoul. It was not the answer his father had planned for. For 7 months after his return, Min-jun played his role with a fidelity that would have impressed his father if his father had known it was a performance. He attended every meeting he was invited to. He asked intelligent questions about the legitimate business holdings. He shadowed Oh Sang-min, the legal intermediary, through 3 property transactions, taking notes with the diligent focus of a man genuinely learning the family trait. He had dinner with his parents every Sunday with the consistency of a devoted son, passing dishes, deflecting his father's probing assessments of his professional development with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 8 years being underestimated by people who assumed British education was primarily aesthetic. He was, during this period, accumulating. Not money, not position, evidence. He moved through the organization's peripheral operations with the access afforded by his name and his father's carefully graduated trust, and he documented, in a notebook kept not in the apartment, not in any location connected to the family, but in a rented storage unit in Siadimingu whose existence he had disclosed to no one. Everything he witnessed, everything he inferred, and everything he could verify. He was methodical. He was patient. He was, without quite meaning to be, his father's son in the most ironic possible configuration. Ha-eun found the notebook on a Tuesday in October. Not in the storage unit. She didn't know about the storage unit. She found a secondary set of notes, earlier drafts, in a folder inside Min-jun's laptop which he had left open while she was collecting his laundry from his room, and which she glanced at for approximately 3 seconds before understanding completely what she was looking at. She stood in his room for a long time. Then she closed the laptop, finished collecting the laundry, went to the kitchen, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at the table where she had built 23 years of financial architecture for a man she loved and an empire she had helped construct from the first brick. The tea went cold. She did not tell Tae-sung. She did not destroy the notes. Some walls, she had decided at that kitchen table with the cold tea, were built to come down. She just needed to decide whether she would be on the right side of the rubble. Min-jun walked into the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's office on a Tuesday morning in March 2024. He wore a plain dark jacket. He carried a bag containing a laptop, 3 notebooks, a portable hard drive, and a manila envelope. He had slept 4 hours the night before, not from anxiety, but from the particular restless clarity of a man who has made an irreversible decision and is simply waiting for the timeline to catch up with his resolve. He asked to speak with prosecutor Chul. The receptionist told him Chul was in a meeting. Min-jun said he would wait. He waited 40 minutes. Chul, who had spent 17 years building cases against the Haryong Brotherhood with the grim, sustained persistence of a man who had converted professional failure into personal identity, walked out of his meeting to find a 23-year-old sitting in his waiting area with the composed, slightly exhausted expression of someone who had traveled a very long way and fully intended to finish the journey. Chul looked at him, looked at his face, the specific face, unmistakable to anyone who had spent 17 years studying its older version in surveillance photographs, and understood, in approximately 2 seconds, that his Tuesday had just become the most significant day of his career. "Mr. Jang," he said carefully. "Prosecutor Yoon," Min-jun replied. "I have 11 hours of material. I'd like to start immediately if that works for you." Chul, who had thrown a filing cabinet across his office after the 4th failed approach to the Brotherhood, and who had subsequently been gently counseled by 2 separate supervisors to consider whether his investment in this particular case had crossed from professional into psychological, stood very still in his own corridor for a moment. Then he opened the door to his office and said, "Sit down." Min-jun spoke for 11 hours across 3 days. He spoke with the organized, methodical precision of a man who had spent 6 years preparing testimony and 8 years in British higher education, which had given him, among other things, an exceptional ability to present complex information in a structured sequence that prosecutors could follow, verify, and act upon. He was not emotional. He was not dramatic. He laid information down the way his father had always laid moves down, deliberately, sequentially, with full awareness of the cumulative weight. Chul's team worked through 2 nights. By the end of the 3rd day, they had enough for 43 preliminary indictments. The machine began to move. It moved the way large legal machines move, not fast, but with the unstoppable momentum of something that has been given, finally, the solid ground it needs to push against. Warrants were issued. Financial records were subpoenaed. 3 of the Brotherhood's senior lieutenants, presented with the evidence accumulated against them and the option of cooperation, made the eminently rational decision that loyalty to an organization was a reasonable principle right up until the point where it carried a 14-year sentence. They began to talk. 2 more fled the country, 1 to Vietnam, 1 to a jurisdiction whose extradition enthusiasm was conveniently limited, with the panicked speed of men who had assumed this day was theoretical and were now experiencing the acute discomfort of being wrong about something that mattered. 1 lieutenant, a man named Cha Byung-soo who had served as the Brotherhood's territory head in Mapo-gu for 11 years and who had, throughout those 11 years, cultivated a reputation for unshakable composure, issued a statement through his lawyer claiming he had been on a personal wellness retreat in Jeju Island for the entirety of the relevant period. This claim was undermined, comprehensively and somewhat brutally, by 47 phone records, 3 surveillance logs, and a receipt from a Gangnam restaurant dated to the specific evening his alibi required him to be in Jeju. The Seoul tabloids covered this particular detail with the gleeful, sustained energy of an institution that had been waiting years for exactly this caliber of material. Tae-sung found out on a Wednesday. Not from law enforcement. Not from a warrant. From Oh Sang-min, the legal intermediary, who called at 6:47 in the morning with the strained, careful voice of a man delivering information he would have paid significant money not to possess. Tae-sung listened without interruption, asked 2 questions, received 2 answers, ended the call. He sat in the kitchen of the Yongsan penthouse, the kitchen where Ha-eun had sat with cold tea 4 months earlier and made her silent, impossible decision, and looked at the Han River through the floor-to-ceiling window for a long time. Ha-eun came in at 7. She looked at him. She looked at his face, which she had been reading with complete fluency for 23 years, and she saw something there she had never seen before in all those years of crisis, of competition, of cold strategic calculation. She saw a man who had not seen it coming. She poured 2 cups of coffee, set one in front of him, sat down across the table. "How long did you know?" he asked, without looking away from the river. A long silence. "Long enough," she said. He nodded slowly. "Once." The gesture of a man receiving information that hurts and deciding, in real time, not to compound the wound with anger he couldn't afford. He picked up the coffee, drank it. Outside, Seoul moved through its Wednesday morning with the magnificent indifference of a city that contained multitudes and prioritized none of them. Somewhere across town, in a government building whose corridors smelled of fluorescent lighting and institutional carpet, 43 indictments were being processed with the steady, irreversible rhythm of a machine that had finally found its footing. The empire was not falling. It had already fallen. They were just now hearing the sound. Every empire ends on a Wednesday. Not a dramatic Friday, not a cinematic Sunday at dusk with golden light and meaningful shadows falling across a man's face in artistically composed angles. A Wednesday. Ordinary, unremarkable, slightly overcast, smelling of convenience store coffee and Seoul traffic, and the specific mundane persistence of a city that has outlasted every single person who ever believed they owned it. Jang Tae-sung was arrested at 6:17 in the evening, outside a samgyeopsal restaurant in Yongsan, still holding a takeout bag. He had gone himself. Not sent a driver, not delegated, gone himself, on foot. The way he had moved through Busan's streets at 17 before power had made simplicity a logistical complexity. Perhaps he had known, in the way that men who have spent their lives reading the temperature of every room eventually develop the ability to read the temperature of their own ending, that it was coming. Perhaps the walk, the ordinary errand, the takeout bag, was its own kind of statement, a final, private assertion that underneath everything he had built and become and orchestrated across 30 years, there was still a man from Seoul who could walk to a restaurant and carry his own food home. Or perhaps he was just hungry. The arrest team was professional, quiet, and numerically excessive in the way that law enforcement tends to be when arresting someone they have been trying to arrest for 17 years and remain faintly convinced might somehow escape the laws of procedural reality through sheer force of reputation. 8 officers, 3 vehicles, a perimeter that would have been appropriate for a small military operation. Tae-sung looked at all of it without expression. He did not run. He did not speak. He did not perform the indignation or the wounded dignity that lesser men defaulted to when the machinery of consequence finally arrived. He stood on the pavement outside the restaurant with the takeout bag in his hand and allowed the handcuffs to be applied with a stillness so complete that 2 of the arresting officers, both of whom had specifically requested this assignment, found it mildly unnerving. One of them reached for the takeout bag. Tae-sung looked at him. The officer stepped back. He kept the takeout bag all the way to processing. The Seoul tabloids, who had been tipped off with suspicious efficiency, Seoul, for all his prosecutorial rectitude, was not entirely immune to the dramatic gesture, photographed the arrest from 3 angles. The image that ran on every front page the following morning was not the handcuffs, not the officers, not the fleet of vehicles. It was the takeout bag. The last Korean Mafia king and his pork belly. One headline read, with the cheerful irreverence of a publication that had waited years for this moment and intended to enjoy every syllable of it. The trial lasted 14 months. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in South Korean legal history, not because the evidence was insufficient, but because there was so much of it, structured across so many layers of corporate architecture, that the court required 3 forensic accountants, 2 international legal consultants, and a dedicated document management system just to maintain organizational coherence. Ha-eun's financial construction, which had been designed to be impenetrable from the outside, turned out, once someone who understood it from the inside began explaining it, to be comprehensively, devastatingly transparent. Min-jun testified for 9 days. He sat in the witness box with the composed, slightly pale stillness of a man who had made his decision months ago and was now simply completing the work. He answered every question directly. He did not embellish. He did not editorialize. He presented information the way his father had always presented power, quietly, completely, with full confidence in the cumulative weight. Tae-sung watched his son testify from the defendant's table with an expression that the courtroom artists, who sketched proceedings with the intense concentration of people aware that history was happening, consistently failed to capture accurately. It was not rage, not betrayal's theatrical mask. It was something more interior than either, the expression of a man engaged in a private reckoning so complete and so personal that its surface manifestation was simply stillness. On the seventh day of Min Jun's testimony, during a recess, Tae-sung's lawyer leaned over and asked if he wanted to send any message to his son through appropriate channels. Tae-sung considered this for a long moment. No, he said. Then, after a pause that lasted approximately 10 seconds and felt considerably longer, tell him he prepared well. His lawyer stared at him. Tell him, Tae-sung repeated, with the quiet finality of a man who meant it entirely. Haun did not testify. The prosecution had considered calling her. Her knowledge of the financial architecture was, in purely evidentiary terms, potentially the most valuable testimony available. But Min Jun, during his pretrial preparation, had been specifically and repeatedly clear on one point. His mother had, in the months before his approach to the prosecutors, made a choice whose nature he understood completely and whose cost he refused to compound. The prosecution, weighing practical strategy against the complexity of compelling testimony from a woman whose cooperation was uncertain and whose legal exposure was significant, ultimately agreed. Haun sat in the courtroom gallery for every session of the trial. She sat in the same seat every day, 7th row, left side, where she could see both the defendant's table and the witness box simultaneously. She watched her husband and her son occupy opposite positions in the same room for 14 months with the composed, quietly devastated attention of a woman who had loved both of them without reservation and was now watching the full cost of that love be publicly audited. She brought 2 cups of coffee in a thermos every morning, drank one, left the other. Nobody asked her who the second cup was for. The verdict came on a Thursday morning in autumn. Jang Tae-sung was convicted on 29 of 43 counts: organized crime leadership, financial fraud, tax evasion across multiple jurisdictions, and 3 counts relating to the Brotherhood's territorial enforcement operations during the late 1990s that the prosecution had, with considerable forensic ingenuity, managed to connect to a paper trail that Tae-sung had believed, with reasonable confidence, no longer existed. He had been wrong. It was, by his own internal accounting, the ruthlessly honest one, maintained separately from the version presented to the world, perhaps the 4th time in 30 years he had been wrong about something significant. He was aware this was a better record than most. He was also aware that the 4th mistake had cost everything the first 3 had built. He was sentenced to 22 years. He received it in the same stillness with which he had received the handcuffs, the testimony, and the 14 months of proceedings, the composure not of a man who didn't feel it, but of a man who had decided, somewhere in the architecture of his character, that what he felt was his own business and the courtroom's business was facts. What happened after is less cinematic than what came before, which is usually how it goes with real endings. The Brotherhood dissolved, not dramatically, not in a single moment of organizational collapse, but in the gradual, inevitable way that structures dissolve when the load-bearing element is removed. Territories were absorbed by other organizations. The legitimate businesses, separated from their criminal infrastructure by the prosecution's asset division, continued to operate under new management with the cheerful indifference of companies that had always been profitable and were not particularly invested in the biography of their previous owners. Haesong Creative released a new act in the spring following the verdict. The single did reasonably well. Nobody connected it to anything. Yoon Ji-chul was promoted. He accepted with the measured satisfaction of a man who had wanted this for 17 years and had learned, across those 17 years, to be suspicious of wanting things too much. He kept the dented filing cabinet in his new office. When people asked about it, he gave a different answer every time. Baek Joon-ho, who had spent the years since his removal from the Brotherhood in a self-imposed semi-exile in Incheon, nursing grievances with the dedicated energy of a man who had converted bitterness into a lifestyle, was arrested in the trial's secondary sweep on charges related to his unauthorized territorial negotiations, the same ones Tae-sung had documented in the red envelope 17 years earlier and which had, with the comprehensive irony that reality occasionally deploys, resurfaced. In Min Jun's documentation, he received 6 years. He did not take it with composure. Min Jun moved to Busan. not to hide. He was not a man who hid, having demonstrated this conclusively in the most public way available. But because Seoul had become a city whose every corner held a memory with a weight he wasn't yet ready to carry daily, and Busan was where the story had started, and there was something in him that felt the pull of origins as a place to begin again. He rented a small apartment in Seoul, fourth floor. He did not choose this deliberately. He discovered it after he had already signed the lease, and he stood at the window on the first morning and looked down at the street below, the produce vendor, the pedestrians, the ordinary commerce of an ordinary Busan morning, and felt the specific, complex weight of a place that means something you don't have the language for yet. He started working with a legal aid organization in Busan's Port District. Young men from the margins of the city, the kind of men his father had once recruited, the kind of men the system processed with efficient indifference. He was not, he understood clearly, in a position to save anyone. He was in a position to be useful, which was different from saving and considerably more sustainable. He was 24 years old. He had a business degree, a complicated last name, a storage unit full of notebooks that the prosecution had returned to him after the trial, and the particular clarity of someone who has done the hardest thing they will ever do and discovered, on the other side of it, that they are still standing. Ha-eun visited Tae-sung for the first time 6 months after sentencing. She sat across from him in the prison visiting room with the same composed attention she had brought to every session of the 14-month trial. He looked older, not diminished. Tae-sung diminished was a concept the universe seemed structurally unwilling to accommodate, but older, in the specific way that men who have operated at maximum intensity for 30 years age when the intensity is removed. Like a river slowed to a lake. Still deep, just quieter. They sat for a moment without speaking. Two people who had known each other so completely for so long that silence between them had always been its own full conversation. Min-jun is in Busan, she said finally. Something moved across his face. Brief. Controlled. Real. Seoul, he asked. She looked at him. Yes. He was quiet for a long time. Good, he said. And then, after another silence, with the careful weight of a man spending words he had been saving for months. He should know where things start, so he understands where to build from. Ha-eun looked at her husband, the most dangerous man she had ever known, the most disciplined, the most brilliant, the most infuriating, and the one whose capacity for love had always been real even when it was buried so deep beneath strategy and structure that it required excavation to locate, and felt something release in her chest that had been held, at great personal cost, for a very long time. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at it, then up at her. He did not speak. He didn't need to. They had always been equally matched, and matching, in this moment, meant understanding that some things were too large and too true for words and deserved, instead, the dignity of silence. She visited every month after that. Min-jun visited for the first time on a Sunday in spring, unannounced, which Tae-sung would have predicted if he had been able to predict it, because his son had inherited, among other things, a preference for arriving in his own time on his own terms. They sat across from each other for a long time. Father and son, king and the man who ended the kingdom. Two people who were, beneath all of it, simply themselves, complicated, serious, marked by the same Busan blood and the same dark, measuring eyes and the same fundamental seriousness about the world that was, perhaps, the most honest thing the father had ever given the son. You prepared well, Tae-sung said. Min-jun recognized the message. He had been told, through the lawyer, through the formal distance of a recess in a courtroom. Hearing it directly, in his father's voice, in this room, landed differently. I learned from you, Min-jun said. It was the most complicated sentence either of them had ever spoken. It contained everything. The inheritance, the irony, the love, the rupture, the fact that even in opposition a son carries his father's architecture inside him and builds with it in directions the father never intended and cannot entirely disown. Tae-sung looked at his son for a long moment. Then he did something that Min-jun would remember for the rest of his life, that Ha-eun would hear about from both of them separately, and in the same words, that would become, in the private mythology of what remained of the Jang family, the moment the rubble became foundation. He laughed. Not the controlled, Minimal, strategic near smile that had served as his public expression of amusement for 30 years. A real laugh. Brief, unguarded, rising from somewhere below the architecture, from the 12-year-old at the window in Seoul, who had once watched a man in a black sedan make the world rearrange itself and had thought, with enormous and ultimately ironic ambition, be the thing the world rearranges itself for. The world had rearranged itself, just not in the direction he had planned. There was something in that. He had decided somewhere in the long quiet of his first 6 months of incarceration that was not entirely without dignity. You build an empire. The empire produces a son. The son, carrying everything you taught him about patience and documentation and the long game and the unbearable weight of knowing things other people don't know, uses all of it to dismantle what you built. You cannot call that a failure. You cannot call it anything except the most complete, costly, and, in the architecture of some long justice he was only beginning to understand, appropriate outcome a man like him could have received. The last Korean Mafia king did not go out in a blaze. No final speech. No dramatic last stand. He went out in handcuffs on a Wednesday, carrying pork belly takeout, and the thing that brought him down was the same thing that had built him up: patience, documentation, and a refusal to stop until the ledger balanced. He had taught his son too well. And somewhere in a 4th-floor apartment in Seoul, Busan, in the neighborhood where a 12-year-old had once watched power move through a street and decided to become it, a young man stood at a window every morning and looked at the ordinary world below and chose, every single day, to build something different. Not an empire. Something that could last. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of person you are, the kind who finishes what they start. Jang Min-jun made the hardest choice a son can make, and he made it because he refused to stay silent while wrong things were the face of family. If you believe that real courage isn't about what you gain, but about what you're willing to lose for what's right, hit that like button. Subscribe if you believe that legacies should be built on truth, not fear. And drop a comment below. Was Min-jun a traitor, or the only hero in this story? Only the Baek Jun-hos of this world, the ones who confuse loyalty with complicity, won't leave an answer.